One size fits all seems like a good idea for clothes until you try them on. Same goes for healthcare. That's why United Healthcare offers flexible, budget-friendly coverage for medical, vision, dental, and more. Learn more at uh1.com.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
Hello, 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 mega orderers. I am Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinninmont.
And this is Disorder, a show where we occasionally get so excited. We just can't hide it. And even our mad, and crazily disordered world can make us have this feeling. Oh my God, I wish you could see me right now. My grin is just ear to ear. I'm so bloody excited that the UK is going to general election on July 4th. I have been feeling simultaneously like the cat who got the mouse, the dog who caught the car, and the podcaster who got the election he wanted. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And you know what's so interesting is that despite this inner joy and exuberance, I can't really share it with my native-born British friends. Whenever I'm chatting about this with them, they want to rain on my parade, they poo-poo my man crush on Starmer. I explain he is a better, younger, more competent, and more northern version of Biden. And they say, you're misplaced and delusional. He's not like Biden at all. But we're going to come to those anecdotes of how my friends, interestingly, on the left and the right, Remainers and Leavers all say that I'm wrong to be so excited about this election. But because I am this excited, I wanted to have this episode to share my outsider's worldview on why July 4th should become a new holiday on this side of the pond to be celebrated ever so originally with grilling, garden parties, and fireworks as Britain's true independence from Neopopulists Day. And to best explore these exciting events, I am joined by my Scottish doppelganger that you have heard on the pod before. And she and I are going to discuss what the election could mean for UK foreign policy, what this means for events north of the border, and if my hopes for the potential implosion of the SNP are too optimistic. Welcome, Jane.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jane, before we get into all of the theories and the excitement, on its face, why would the even hapless Richie Sunak call a general election on a day when he would be standing out in the rain and his announcement would be drowned out by Labour's 1997 music anthem?
Many people in the Conservative Party have been asking the same question. This did come as a surprise. He said he'd have the election in the second half of the year. It's going to be 2 days in to the second half of the year. And what the message is from Conservative HQ is that, look, there's been some good news. Inflation is down. Net migration is also down by 10%. It was announced the day after. And, let's take the initiative and go for it. Let's not sit around being lame ducks. The other explanation is the fear that instead of things can only get better, things would only get worse. That the next few months might have some economic bad news. They're going to be tricky in quite a number of ways, and it might be better to get ahead of that by going now. But it is really interesting. This is one of the powers the Prime Ministers have, is to get an advantage by choosing a date. And many are mystified by why you would choose this date now.
I am not mystified. I am just so thrilled. So I'm going to give my 3 reasons, dear listeners, on why I think that this election timing has come about. The most important one is, interestingly, not being mentioned much in the mainstream media. I think that after his shellacking in the local elections, and that's earlier in May, for non-Brits, for some bizarre reason that I'll never understand, these local British elections don't necessarily marry up with the same timings of any kind of general election, and then all the constituencies don't go at the same time. But we had London mayoral elections. We had the East and West Midlands elections, one of which was a newly created mayoral thing. And the Tories got shellacked. Labour gained seats. The Lib Dems gained seats. It was glorious. But I assume Sunak was like, uh-oh, my own party is coming for me. If the letters aren't in at the 1922 committee already, they're coming in. And he just sees the Grim Reaper in the face of Sir Graham Brady coming ever so slowly as the Grim Reaper came for Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, many others before him. He's like, oh God, do I want to go down as an unelected PM who never even contested an election and be shoved away to Silicon Valley in ignominy? No, I'm going to take my 1 or 2% chance of winning this election rather than just being swallowed up by my own party. So that's point one. Point two, and I'm going to put something from buddy of the podcast, Arthur Snell's Substack, in the show notes about this. If he had waited till November or December, he would not have been able to choose all of the Tory candidates in the areas where people are standing down. Other more Brexity, more hard right, more Braverman, Priti Patel, neo-populist, anti-migrant types would have been chosen. He nipped that in the bud, and he can have more mainstream Tories. And he can now run a more one nation because he isn't really a one nation, but he can run a more traditional right rather than neo-populist right campaign. And then I think he knew, based on some intel, about the fact that Nigel Farage had various commitments, and that if he chose the election right now, he would be contesting it against Reform's Richard Tice before the Reform Party could really become a thing. So he's keeping Farage on the bench. And if he had waited, Farage and Reform really would have been growing and able to hurt them as he established himself more as a traditional conservative and not a Brexity neo-populist nutcase. And he's just like, okay, you know what? I don't care if I lose. I'm going to be hurting the neo-populists and the anti-migrant and the whatever. And I'm going to say that he's going to go down in history as someone who actually hurt the neo-populists and the right by doing this. And, hats off to you. Chapeau, Sunak.
That's really interesting. It's very plausible. But right now, he is getting absolutely zero credit for any of that.
Not on this podcast, because an orderer's got to order.
Hear, hear.
So, Jane, what are the other things that are going on here? Does he actually think he might win? Or is it what I imagined? He knew he would lose later. He has maybe a 1 to 2% chance now. And therefore, he's just like, I'll go for it?
That's right. Obviously, everyone is officially fighting this election hard, but they know that time is up and Britain has political cycles and this one is coming to an end now. I think everybody knows this. That's one of the reasons that a lot of MPs are upset the election is coming early, because they were trying to plan what they expected would be their last few months. And that raises questions for foreign policy as well, because David Cameron's been making a big push on a number of issues that he cares about, including trying still to get a hostage ceasefire deal in Gaza, trying to get more G7 support for Ukraine and commitments at the NATO summit. All of that is now disappearing as everybody goes straight into election mode.
Well, that's a perspective that maybe some of the ordering that Britain could be doing isn't going to be happening, because one of the things of the global enduring disorder is the dysfunctionality in our democratic systems makes it impossible for people to know what's going to come next. And for example, because you didn't know how Brexit was going to be implemented, the pound tanked and then it went up, and then business leaders can't invest because they don't know what's going to happen. And it's like foreign policy can't even be made properly because you don't know when a general election is coming. So that's not good. That is a disordering aspect of just randomly having an election that makes it difficult to negotiate a ceasefire or give aid to Ukraine or whatever. I want to come back to the foreign policy stuff. While we're just talking about response to the timing, I would like to share some anecdotes about how my friends here in the UK have responded to my giddy excitement. And then maybe you, as our truly native Brit who's resident here, can explain to me why the British psyche seems to be so inherently pessimistic. And like people say Americans are more optimistic, but I've really seen it in these last few days. So I would say the majority of my friends are probably from the anti-Corbyn Labour to the Remainer Tory spectrum. I have some outliers, but most people sit in this middle. And yet, I have heard from those more on the left of that spectrum, oh my God, Jason, the sky is falling. If Sunak called the election now, we might lose. Starmer is unexciting. He's done so bad over Gaza. You don't understand. He walked back his commitments. He hasn't even stayed true to the green energy pledge. And now this thing about tuition fees. And oh my God, the sky's falling. He's going to lose. You can't trust him. He's a flip-flopper. And I'm like, no, that's insane. He has changed and modified his policies as circumstances have changed, just like John Kerry. And he's someone who's like practical and is, vowing to create this British energy and to nationalize things and to create green jobs. And he's just what people need. And then I've heard on the far left, he's complicit in the quote unquote genocide in Gaza. And I think that's absurd. We learned that Britain doesn't even supply 0.2% of the arms used by Israel, not even 0.2%. And that any calling for a ceasefire, not calling for a ceasefire by Britain has no leverage. He's been absolutely fine and absolutely centrist on everything having to do with Israel, Gaza. So, I don't get that left-wing critique. And then if we get to more the center-right, the kind of Remainer Tory friends of mine, oh, he's so boring. He doesn't have any charisma. And I'm like, wait, that's not true. He says what he means, and we don't want to have a charismatic charlatan like a Boris Johnson. We need competent leadership. So that's good. That should be a plus and not a negative. But I have a man crush on Gordon Brown. So I found Gordon Brown to be the most charismatic British politician of my lifetime. So charisma to me is someone who is like a normal guy who has mastery of all the details and is a true expert. And Starmer projects to me this technocratic energy. But then people more to the right have said to me things like, you don't get it. He's a socialist. He grew up as a socialist. He's only pretended to be non-socialist to fight against the Corbyn legacy. But he was in the socialist youth movement. He's going to raise taxes. And I'm like, yeah, taxes on the rich in this country are too low. Wealth is not taxed. If you own a £5 million pile here in Hampstead, you pay £3,000 a year of tax on it. And if you owned a $1 million house in New Jersey, you'd pay £20,000 in local taxes on it. Do you know what I mean? It's absolutely not fair. Okay, so that's what I've heard. I have not met people who are understanding how glorious this is. Why is this, Jane?
Like you say, neither of these candidates actually have much in the way of personality. ITV News was showing some polling figures the other night saying that roughly 1 in 4 people would say that either Starmer or Sunak has a lot of personality. And I bet you if you surveyed your friends, you would not find 1 in 4 of them saying that either has a lot of personality.
Would be 1 in 30.
And I completely agree with you also that people do not necessarily want personality. We've got some big personalities in politics. Some of them do cut through and become quite successful. We could look at George Galloway or Nigel Farage or Lee Anderson. But nobody actually wants them to be running the country. And where the battle lines are being drawn, which we can come on to talk about more, it's really about competing for competence, wanting to be seen as the safe pair of hands. It's not a competition over worldviews. It's not a competition over visions. Is a contrast with 1997 and the election of Tony Blair, another centrist who wanted to take votes from Conservative supporters, but he was very charismatic. He had a big vision. Starmer is more solid, hardworking, straightforward, very, very risk averse. And I don't think there's very many that would see Sir Keir Starmer, former Director of Public Prosecutions, as a kind of stealth socialist beyond the official kind of social democratic policies of the Labour Party. There have been a huge amount of criticisms about the stance over Gaza. I personally think that both Starmer and a number of other senior Labour figures said things about international law in TV interviews that totally contradicted and undermined months of them trying to build up Labour as the party that, in their view, would contrast with the Conservatives by coming back to international law. So there were a lot of things said that they probably regret now that have hung over them. But really, I think that it's all been about domestic politics, and there's been a real reluctance to take a tough line on Gaza because one of the driving forces in Starmer's campaign is to not be Jeremy Corbyn and to be solidly in the centre when it comes to defence and security issues, because he feels that is an area where he's going to be attacked. So what is being said about Gaza is really much, much, much more to do with British politics than it is about the Middle East. And definitely Labour MPs and candidates will say what you said: how much does it matter? We're in opposition. But obviously that's all going to change very soon. And they have been changing their tune somewhat, for example, saying that they will support the ICC in the choices that it chooses to make.
Yeah, and I don't feel comfortable with that, but that's like neither here nor there. I think the ICC is completely out of line. But where are the battle lines being drawn, Jane, on the foreign policy issues? And are they going to be relevant at all to this election?
So there's much, much less foreign policy differences in this election than the last two elections that we had with Jeremy Corbyn as leader, where you really saw an election where Labour was very left-wing, the Conservatives were very right-wing, and there was a real ideological split. And that has gone completely on foreign policy. They are just jostling each other for space in the centre ground with only a very few differences.
And I think that's healthy, because when Britain was strong in the period of, say, 1815 to 1914, the period of kind of undisputed British hegemony, it was a period of consensus foreign policy. Consensus in how empire should be defended, and consensus in terms of how Britain should use its domestic might to do foreign policy. So Britain is obviously in a much diminished stature relative to 200 years ago, but it could have a greater foreign policy moment if there was an agreement on how the domestic advantages, the ties to the Gulf and the continent and the US, could be used in a multi-decade-long way, and that can only work with consensus. So I like to hear consensus. Tell us more.
And indeed, the polarised state of the US creates very real problems when administrations can completely flip-flop on something like the Iran nuclear deal, which has ultimately just played into Iran getting a much more advanced nuclear program while the American politicians snipe at each other.
Yeah, Britain needs to be a mature leader, because given the uncertainties of a potential swing from a regular centrist Biden to a neopopulist megalomaniac nutcase in Trump, who might abandon various NATO commitments and might pick on Iran just for domestic partisan advantage rather than having a real policy, it's going to have to be Britain and Germany who lead the West. France will do its own leading, but France has its own views. But to lead a coherent Western bloc, it will be time for David Lammy to step up. So he spoke at Chatham House yesterday, Jane, and I know you followed what he said. Did it seem competent to you? Did it inspire you? What does it, give a sense in terms of how a Labour government might do in terms of global ordering?
It seemed very plausible when you could see this man readying himself to be making his first speech as Foreign Secretary. He introduced it by talking of a new era of geopolitical competition being framed by a global struggle between the US and China and made multipolar by regional powers. And indeed, you'll like this, he said that we're not so much in a new world order as a new polarised disorder. So I think we cannot disagree with that. Indeed, that could be the whole subject for a podcast.
Oh my God. So he agrees that we're not in a multipolar world. We are in a global disorder. And that is what every orderer has got to believe, because if you grasp that there's disorder out there, then you're going to understand your mission to order. I wish that I had had him on the podcast before he became too big a deal. He probably can't come on the pod now because he's going to be foreign secretary of a G7 country, and he's not going to have time to come on our show. But I really like it. I wish I get to know him more.
Open invitation, David Lammy.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, this vision, though, of this more competitive world, and that being something that's going to be with us in an enduring way for a long time, it is really similar to the picture of the world that David Cameron sees. And it is really similar to what people in the Foreign Office and the MOD have been talking about for some time, but especially since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a world where there are state threats, also a world where there's a need to partner with whatever people currently want to call the global south. Diplomats often speak of middle ground powers, the global middle ground. And Lammy's spoken a lot about that. But that's not a change of policy. It's just what is rational. Basically, people who are influential, especially regional powers, but kind of non-aligned. So countries might include India, they might include Saudi Arabia, countries that the UK can work with, but cannot count on them permanently siding with the UK on everything. They don't believe in a shared liberal international order. Your relationship with them might be quite transactional.
I would call these the swing states in the ordering-disordering sweepstakes. And it is the existence of these middle ground powers which makes so clear why the autocracies versus democracies framing, which is what a lot of pundits and think tanks are hardening into as their way to explain and contextualize the mid-21st century competition, I think that's wrong. Because if you get into democracies and autocracies, it makes the UAE and Saudi, and to some extent Modi's India, people that we can't work with because they're not really democratic and they're going to be on the autocrat's side. But no. These people could be orderers. We really need the UAE and Qatar and Saudi, but then also certain Latin American and East Asian countries on our side. Otherwise, the Putin, Russia, Orban, Bolsonaro-y axis is going to be too strong because it's going to have all the dictatorships automatically with it. And I think that that's a mistake. There are particularly high income, high stability autocracies which need to be on our side, that these are ordering powers, particularly if we play nicely with them. So, yeah, I like what Lammy is saying, but this is a foreign policy / geopolitics podcast, that it makes sense for us to be chatting about what Lammy's position is and how it's interesting that it's not so dissimilar to David Cameron's, and that it shows a return to competence within the FCDO and MOD because they're working on multi-year stuff. But you can throw up your hands and say, who cares? Voters don't vote on foreign policy. They might vote on foreign policy towards the EU because that's conceived as like a domestic issue. But like, I'm going to turn to you and say, is there even 1% of people who, when they go into that ballot box and they're debating between Lib Dem, Labour, SNP, Tory, Plaid Cymru, whatever, are going to be choosing on foreign policy? Is it even relevant?
I think there will be people who don't go into the ballot box because they are so angry about what's happening in Gaza and the disjunction between politicians who talk about international order and the seeming inability or unwillingness to solve the situation so many months on. So I think that is one that has some
but that's a shame because that's an irrational decision. They're not going to get more order in Gaza because they didn't vote. And I think anyone, whether they're in Michigan or in Bradford or Birmingham, who does that doesn't grasp how kind of important voting is. And I would, strongly encourage them to choose some candidate. I won't even say which one, but choose a candidate.
But we are in a state where the whole issue of trust in politicians per se is very deeply damaged. So that will be one of the reasons that some of your Labour friends are worried that turnout will simply be low, that people won't be bothered because there's frustration and anger with the political class in general. At the same time, many people say that it's not oppositions that win elections, it's governments that lose them. And probably that call for change is something that is going to be bringing some people out, more to kick a government out than to bring one in.
Yeah, but not too much change. I think this is the key point. This is why I find Starmer so inspiring and so messianic to me. It is his non-messianic personality, which is messianic. In other words, what we need now, and Biden channeled this in 2016, but he's too old and he's too out of it for it now, is to say, I messianically want to return to normal. It's like Clemenceau's party before World War I. They were the radical party in French politics, but they were radical about their centrism. That was what a radical was in France in 1910. So Starmer is messianic to me because he appeals to red wall seats by saying, we're going to go back to the traditional values, some of which are socially conservative, some of which are just about fair play. Others are just about like Britain being Britain and valuing the freedoms of Englishmen and, you know, the regular role that Britain plays in the world. And Britain has had a long tradition, for example, of trying to improve social mobility and moving gradually to do programs, not just the NHS, but to build infrastructure and things like this. And they've abandoned it since this Thatcher moment. So he's saying, I'm going to just do Britain. Why are people not inspired by that, though?
Well, I think you said it with the non-messianic messiah,
But
you know,
that's
the prophet of
me.
technocracy. You know, maybe it's not easy to get people super excited about it, but I think it does have an appeal. I think that maybe not as much as in the US, but certainly to some extent here, people want the government to leave them alone. They don't want to have to think about politicians day to day, but they do want to be able to call the doctor, speak to somebody and get a doctor's appointment. They want to be able to send their kid to a decent local school. They want lots of stuff that's done by the local council to work, but they don't want to know who the local councillors are. They just want it to work.
That's the same as me. I absolutely do not want to know who my local councillors are, but I just want it to work. That means that people are sensible.
And this is the stuff that really affects most people's lives. As you say, the stuff with the EU does affect people's lives, but Labour's also been super careful about that because they don't want to fight another Brexit election, and probably most other people don't either. But there has been that emphasis that, you know, we can make things a bit easier with the EU. There won't be the personal animus with other leaders. I think for the kind of people that are really interested in foreign policy, that is really significant on the defence and security front, especially when it comes to, you know, how can the UK be effective in NATO and try and get NATO and the EU working together and not having like totally separate goals at a time when the EU's trying to make itself into a defence and security player in a kind of unprecedented way. But I do think that that's not something that interests the majority of people.
I do think that there is something meta going on here, which is that it's signaling competence. It's signaling a return to centrism. I think it will appeal in the red wall, the stuff that you're saying. But isn't Scotland very pivotal in whether or not it's going to get over the hump or not? Because as I heard my main man from Strathclyde University, I am talking about none other than Sir John Curtis, talking about the maths. I'm talking about my electoral maths. In various Tory-held seats in England, you need a 20-point swing to get the seat. But in Scotland, where the SNP holds a seat by a very small amount, you might only need a 5 to 10% swing from SNP to Labour to get those seats. And so Scotland has a lot of these marginal seats where the potential, what they call pickup or gain, is much easier. And given the corruption, given everything that has happened with Nicola Sturgeon and now Hamza Yosef and the falling out and the this and the that and the corruption scandals and the whatever, I'm psyched. So please be our resident expert. Tell us what's going down north of Hadrian's Wall.
One of the super interesting things about the success of the SNP against Labour in recent years is that the SNP have got loads of votes from people who do not want Scotland to be independent. Because the majority of Scots have never voted for Scotland to be independent. Of course, we had a fairly close run indie ref, but there's a whole bunch of people who will vote for the SNP if they think they are decent politicians and they think, you know, Sturgeon's honest, Hamza Yusuf seems like a nice guy, gosh, we're sick of Labour, but we wouldn't necessarily want that to translate into the potential disorder and chaos that might come.
That this is like people in Egypt or Tunisia who would vote for the Muslim Brotherhood, even though they don't fast Ramadan and they don't go to the mosque. They vote for the Muslim Brotherhood because they're like, all these other politicians are corrupt. We're fed up with the dictatorship that we've had for so long. The Muslim Brotherhood is clean. They're not corrupt. Then when the Muslim Brotherhood got into power, they ended up being just as corrupt and as incompetent as what had come before. And people were really shocked because the Brotherhood had made themselves out to be honest and clean and anti-politician politicians. And this seems to me as a non-Scot what has happened in Scotland, which is that it's like, we're clean, we're pure, we're not tainted by Westminster politics, we're above all of that. And then they get into power and they have campaign financing scandals and they've been just as incompetent as any Westminster party.
Despite the many differences between the SNP and the Muslim Brotherhood, I think you hit on something there, and how people often vote on who they think is going to sort their lives out in the next 4 years and not what they think is the super long-term vision that might never come to pass. Scotland is a more left-wing political community than England, but it's also quite socially conservative in many places, especially outside Glasgow and Edinburgh. And the SNP kind of brings together a weird coalition of, what used to be called the Tartan Tories and the much more progressive kind of CND. And that coalition has really got into trouble over social justice issues. So people are still going to prefer an economically sort of centre-left party, but it might be that Labour gains some ground back over some of those kind of identity politics issues that have become really divisive in recent years, and where Labour again is trying to take a kind of centre ground. And, it would be coming back after having been trounced for quite some time. So in a way, it would be returning to a more normal position where Scotland does have quite a steady long-term support for Labour.
Correct. I mean, from Gordon Brown, and then if we go further back in the past, Labour heartlands included the industrial north of England and the industrial south of Scotland, I mean, traditionally. But I want to hear more about kind of how the SNP has come apart. I think I'm getting this name right. Katie Forbes represents a kind of evangelical, Protestant, like almost American-style SNP person. And then you've got the very left-wing, almost green identity politics, SNP voters. So I feel like there's been a lack of coherence there, and that's on the verge of falling out. Just what are we talking about here? 10, 15 seat pickup, 20, 30 seat pickup, and what should we be watching out for? We're recording this on Friday, May 24th, and Keir is in Scotland. So, I mean, that feels really exciting for me.
I mean, Kate Forbes lost to Hamza Yusuf the last time round, but she still represents a strain of people who are very socially conservative. And at the end of the day, it comes from the fact that the SNP is fundamentally a one-issue party. It has sketched out an interesting position for itself relative to many other national parties, because it has gone for a progressive, sort of international, outward-looking stance, rather than a kind of inward-looking anti-migration, let's all go back to tradition type of nationalism, which you see more with the kind of English nationalist parties. But it contains a lot of contradictions, because the unifying factor is simply support for Scottish nationalism, and people have very different views of what that Scottish nation should really look like. So those, contradictions have really come out, but the SNP is important as one of the minor parties that can make a difference to the final outcome, but more in terms of whether they take votes away from Labour and potentially result in a hung parliament.
Yeah, and I don't think they're going to, because I think that the genius, and the reason why I'm so excited, I can't hide it, is that Sunak called this election at the exact moment when the SNP is very weak, the Reform Party isn't ready to go. The hard right of his own party, the Neopopulist right, has not fully played out its opposition to him and the movement towards a Braverman-y part of the Tory party. So I see that the schismatics are weak. Speaking of schismatics, it was announced today that in Islington North, and this is an area like not so far from central London, it like blows my mind, Corbyn is going to be running against the Labour Party. What are the implications of this? What does this mean, Jane?
quite incredible that someone who led the party through 2 elections, albeit unsuccessful elections for the party, is now standing in opposition to his successor. You don't see that very often. But it really reflects how much the thrust of Starmer's leadership has been to be as unlike Corbyn as you can possibly be while still being Labour. And if that's your strategy, there could even be symbolic advantages to the fact that Corbyn is going it alone. We're going to see the Conservatives trying to hammer the line that Starmer served in the Corbyn shadow cabinet and therefore he cannot be trusted because he must secretly be anti-NATO, etc. And Starmer will say, I've taken him out of the party and he is actually standing against Labour. So works from that point of view. It is a reminder, though, that because the parties are in the centre ground on foreign policy, there are people who are left out. Corbyn couldn't win elections, but he had a big support base, especially among the youth. Wouldn't be too surprising if he wins again in Islington North, where he has long been a popular constituency MP. It's not always just because of views on the world order or Gaza or Putin. Sometimes it is about the day-to-day.
Oh, no. That's kind of scary because a North London divided against itself cannot stand. And to think of some other American parallels here, I can think of an example when a former leader of a major political party then ran against his former party. And of course, Theodore Roosevelt did it in 1912 when he had been president for the Republicans, and then he established the Progressive Party known as the Bull Moose Party, and he ran against the Republican Party, of course, to defeat. We have never had a Progressive Party president, but it was a serious attempt, and the Bull Moose Party was a huge movement that then changed the way a lot of Democratic politicians thought about antitrust and other progressive issues. But so the Corbyn thing scares me. I'm just going to be straight up because, yes, many of the youth are going to feel like he's right on Gaza and there need to be more nationalizations and taxes need to be higher. And he may be channeling some correct issues, but he's not an orderer. He's a disorderer. And I feel that injects some disordering into the election. What about this guy, George Galloway? And it's something that all Brits will know, but almost no non-Brits will know who he is. So if you could overview who is this multi-decade-long nutcase within British politics and what are the potential implications that he could have?
Well, George Galloway is a very long-standing left-wing firebrand character from Glasgow who has been around for a long time in British politics. I remember him coming and giving speeches against the Iraq War when I was at university, and he's recently won a by-election as an independent where he's taken a very strong line against the war in Gaza. But interestingly, he also channels some issues more associated with the right, especially being very, very down on illegal migration and kind of branding migrants as a potential threat.
Yeah, he's an alternative for Deutschland in the UK.
But unlike Jeremy Corbyn, who has, with great reluctance, been thrown out of the Labour Party, George Galloway is more of a one-man political band. He was Labour. He broke away from Labour some years ago. He started his own party called Respect. They all fell out with each other, and you ended up with 2 splinter parties, one of which was called Respect, and the other which was amazingly called Respect George Galloway.
So you got to say, it truly is Life of Brian. No, we are the People's Democratic Front for Palestine. No, we are the Popular Democratic People's Front.
Always the left, always the left. But one thing about Galloway is he is an absolutely incredible speaker. He is a demagogue with an incredible vocabulary, a real command of language. He is, politician as entertainer, and he has a very successful TV career, which has taken him to Russia Today and to Press TV, raising quite a lot of questions about parliamentary rules and Ofcom and all of these things. I've met many people in the Middle East who will say, oh, what a great guy, he seems to be saying nice things, because he is a great communicator. But although he may be challenging a larger issue, he doesn't represent a political movement because he is such a particular individual.
after the break, you'll hear Jason's mystical grand unified theory of how British elections affect American elections.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
I want to return to what is the wellspring of my extreme happiness and excitement about this development. And this is the way in which UK elections tend to affect US elections. I have been cultivating since the 1990s my own grand unified theory that the three important diasporas in the US, plus one other country, have a mystical relationship with US elections. These countries are Ireland, Italy, and Israel, due to their implications with the Irish, Italian, and Jewish diasporas, and then the UK. And that these four countries' elections and US elections are mystically linked. For example, when the Likud wins an Israeli election, US mega Jewish donors can be pulled to the right in their donation patterns in US elections. People might have heard of the late Sheldon Adelson. He was instrumental in the funding of Trump and in the articulation of certain policy proposals about the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, the doing of this and that, and how the U.S. should support the settlements. This was able to happen, and he was able to exert this role because the Likud had stayed in power in Israel. If Likud had lost, Sheldon Adelson would have not played that role in the U.S. election. In the Israeli case, this tends to work in terms of donations because Jews don't live in parts of the country in the U.S. which are in swing states. In other words, the Jews live in California, Illinois, Maryland, New York, and Connecticut, which all go Democratic anyway, essentially. I'm oversimplifying. But when you look at the role of Italian Americans, it's more on the question of demographics and elections. If you have multiple cycles where a center-right, conservative, neopopulist-y type person wins in Italy, might I be thinking of Berlusconi? Or, for example, now you have Meloni, who has won there and has been actually quite competent, so to speak, from the neopopulist right. It has pull factors on Italian Americans that pull them towards the more socially conservative or towards voting for similar type people in US elections. Now we get to the Irish. The Irish have the most important implications on US elections, and the vibe of developments, whether it's the Troubles or whatever, the way that things are going on in Ireland affects not only Irish American donors, who are really important, but the 45 to 50 million who self-identify as Irish American. Sometimes people only have 1/4 or 1/8 Irish American ancestry, but they identify as Irish American, and that has a lot of mystical implications in terms of American voting patterns. But then Ireland is the case where the push factors are very powerful. What happens in the US and Irish American money is the decisive factor in how things play out in Ireland. And now we get to Britain. Britain is the granddaddy of them all when it comes to Jason's grand unified theory of push and pull factors elections. And it is not a diasporic effect. It is a peer country effect. And fascinatingly, although Australia, Canada, and New Zealand are peer countries to the US, we have no peer country effect at all because Americans don't give a shit about Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand elections. But they
surely you're flattering us, Jason.
No, I'm going to get there. So there would have been no Trump were there not Brexit. And that was a similar timing to this. That was June 23 before a first week of November election. And this is July 4 before a first week of November election. So it's almost the same distance. It's only 1 week less. And it is that the narratives are tested here first in the UK, and people see what lands. And then the Nigel Farage comes over to the US, and he dresses up in his bizarrely bankery chalk stripe suit, and he goes to Missouri, and he speaks with his absurdly posh accent, and it is bizarre. Like, why would that affect some Missourian pig farmers at the state fair when they see Nigel Farage? But it does, because he uses the messages that have been tested, like, we're going to take back control. We're going to take control of the border. These messages, which are very important in US politics now, were road tested with neopopulism here in the UK first. And if they fall on their face here in the UK, that is extremely meaningful for what plays out in the US. And similarly, in combating them, if the centrist Starmer right, we're just going to have a return to competence, if that works, that is going to have a real amount of data for Biden's team, what he could draw on. Like, for example, Starmer is not saying open borders. He's just saying, I'm against the Rwanda plan, but I'm going to try to bring down net migration, or whatever it is that he's saying. I don't know. But whatever he says, if it works, the American iteration or variation of it should be rolled out. And part of the cosmic grand unified theory is just momentum. Momentum can build in an Italian or Israeli or British election, and it can affect a US election. Whereas if the two were concurrent, in other words, if Sunak didn't call the election until when he needed to, and it played out in November or December, there would be no way for that momentum to be built with the stonking Starmer victory and affect the US, because the neopopulists are running on much more favorable terrain in the US than they are here in the UK. So the centrists are running on more favorable terrain here in the UK than they are in the US. If the centrists win here, they develop momentum, and that will have an impact in terms of how people feel globally and the media narratives about stuff, which will make a 1 to 2 point difference in places like Michigan, Ohio, even places that we're not going to win like Florida. But it is going to have a 1 to 2% pull factor. And I am just so excited because Biden has not been doing so great in certain ways. He's been doing well on the economy. He had a great State of the Union address, but like some things have not gone perfectly. This is something that's going to be giving him 1 to 2% when Starmer comes in with a 60 or an 80 seat majority, and many of his messages just really landed. So I am like the most hopeful I've been in over a year.
Super interesting. I have no way to calculate that kind of effect, but we've definitely seen people give Blair some of the credit, if we can call it credit, for supporting Bush strongly, in the Iraq War and the War on Terror, and getting this reputation and popularity in the US where people perhaps didn't realise that he was, actually into socialised healthcare and things like this. It's also interesting that if Starmer is elected as Prime Minister, one of the very first things that he will do is to go to Washington. So the new parliament in Britain is due to be sworn in on the 9th of July. On the same day, the US will start to host a 3-day NATO summit at the heads of state level. So I think Starmer's team will literally be checking the flight logistics to see if it's possible for him to swear in the new parliament and then cross the Atlantic and show up next to Biden. Now, this is a very sensitive NATO summit for Biden. On one hand, it's a chance to be at the head of this gathering of world leaders. On the other hand, Trump has been attacking NATO, and it will be just about 1 week later that the Republican National Convention starts in Milwaukee.
And this is going to show that mystical impact, Jane, because if Starmer can pack his bags directly from Westminster and get to that NATO summit, he can create and boost narratives to explain the importance of voting for Biden and what it is to be part of a community of like-minded nations and the joy that even centrist Republicans can feel, anti-Trump Republicans, of standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies. And I think that he has a northern, quirky, down-to-earth accent is going to connect to people. And they're going to say, this is our guy. We trust him. We want to work with him. And they don't feel that about a frog leader. That's why French elections have no impact on American elections. It doesn't matter how Anglophilic the French leader is. It just doesn't affect things. It's to have Starmer using the bully pulpit of number 10 in a way that is going to have this mystical effect on American voters. I can't wait for it. I am so excited.
And do you know what? Okay, here is my bet that assuming he is the Prime Minister and he goes there, what he will say, standing next to Biden, is we fully agree that NATO allies must step up and do more burden sharing. We as the UK are spending X amount, probably 2.5% of GDP, more than the target on defence, and we are bringing Europe with us. And Biden will say, yes.
Yeah,
and Trump will say, that's because I told them to do it. But that might leave Trump then validating it's going well with NATO. There is burden sharing. And I do think that, everyone has internalised this, that Europe will be spending more on defence in the years ahead. We've seen also David Lammy saying that, and interestingly being praised to the skies by Elbridge Colby, the figure who is seen by some as a possible national security advisor if Trump wins the election, and who famously thinks Russia is a distraction from the need to prepare for confrontation with China. He's been very impressed by David Lammy because Lammy has said something very simple that he knows Americans want to hear, which is we will step up, we'll pay some more money, and we'll be doing more at our end.
That is great news to hear from Eldridge Colby, Jane, because it means that if the center left puts on its center big boy pants, it can lance the boil of some of this neo-populist appeal. Because getting NATO members to spend 2% of GDP is something that Obama brought in and that we as centrist orderers should want. So if we can do it, we can lance the boil so that it can't be a neo-populist talking point against us. And I think Starmer is going to be able to exert a lot of these things. In other words, he will say, we want to have more skilled migrants. We also want to have certain unskilled migrants who can help in construction and lorry driving and whatever, but we're doing it in a reasonable and rationed way. And that is going to really lance the boil of the anti-migration side if it can be shown that his policies are going to be helping the NHS, bringing down inflation, and doing all the stuff that needs to happen. So, Jane, I think the moment has come. My smile is still ear to ear because I see the potential for ordering, but I need you to order the disorder with me. Will this July 4th election and Starmer's near certain victory bring more global order?
There should be a positive effect to a renewal of government in the UK. I think many people feel we're at the end of a particular political cycle, and instead of hanging around for more months waiting for an election, we'll have more clarity. We probably won't have drastic change. We will likely have a government that wants to do more in terms of supporting the multilateral system and international law. That said, it is the US election that is the big one. And so I think the UK can make an important contribution, but it's not the decisive country here. And certainly, this is what will also be on the minds of the Labour Party, is how they are going to navigate things. For example, their staunch support for Ukraine. If you do have a Trump presidency and Trump wants to prioritise imposing a settlement on that conflict, it will leave the UK in a very difficult position because the UK is still hugely dependent on the US in all of its security policy.
Of course, the US election is the big one. It's the one that matters in the global ordering sweepstakes. We're not debating that. But if Starmer is in place before, and God forbid, Trump does get elected, he can be an orderer, and he can try to do coalition building more coherently, I think. Because someone like Sunak, if they were in place or the election wasn't called till then, he's going to agree with some of the right-wing neoliberalism and some of the anti-migrant bluster and some of the whatever. Although on foreign policy on Ukraine, Sunak is not going to be so dissimilar to Starmer, but just the global order and credentials of a Starmer in place will be better. You're right. It's not like Starmer's victory swings Britain from the disordering camp into the ordering camp, because since Liz Truss has been out, it's not like Britain is a disorderer.
That's right. It's not a disruptive force currently.
Correct.
Yeah.
And there is something disordering about the election itself, that having it sooner does, in an unexpected way, bring about some disordering aspects. I want to end with 2 points. First, an economy point. Inflation is coming down, and the pound is still quite strong, trading at 1.27, which is about the strongest it's been since Brexit. There was a brief period last year where it was up to 1.31, but 1.27 is the strongest that it's been for a multi-week period. However, inflation is still hotter in the UK than in the US. So the rate cuts are being delayed by the Bank of England. What is the implication of all of this? Is there a way in which these better economic numbers and this current state can allow the Tories to run look, we got inflation a little bit under control and the economy is rebounding. You got to stick with us. Don't change horses now that we're making progress?
It's going to take months. Even if there was a rate cut already, it would take time for that to feed through to people's mortgages, which are a huge factor here in the UK. I also think a lot of what is at the front and centre of people's minds is public services, what's happened to the NHS, etc., etc. Now, I'm sceptical that Labour will have any quick solutions to any of these things or to migration, because a lot of them are now complicated structural economic
100%.
issues. But it is going to be really hard for the incumbent government to show small improvements as enough of a reason for them to keep going. I think really it's a lot to do with political cycles, lifespans of governments, and that really not that many of the Conservatives actually expect to win this election for those reasons.
Yes, I think it's so great. They don't even expect to win. They called it knowing they're going to lose. And I'm going to end with this last little Bill Maher style monologue-y thing. As a gambling man, I know that the more variables you have, the greater a chance for a swing or an unpredictable outcome. So if Labour is ahead by 20 points now and you have the election in 3 days, the chance of losing is 0.01%. But if you have it in 10 days, it's 0.02%. And if you have it in 6 days, there can be more swings. Starmer could get a heart attack. All of a sudden, the Chinese could make a $30 billion investment in the Middle East. You know what I mean? Anything crazy can happen.
Could be a terrorist attack.
The more time, the more those things can build. And therefore, having it sooner means there's less chance for X standard deviations of variance. And hence, the gains seem to me to be locked in. And that's the first reason why I see this as very ordering and very exciting. Next point. Parallel elections risk increasing political polarization. I am quoting from an article written by Ben Ansell in the FT on November 24, 2023, that I'm going to put in the show notes. He wrote, parallel elections risks increasing political polarization. In both countries, meaning the US and the UK, voters are increasingly driven by distaste for the opposing party rather than love for their own. This drives the electorate to choices made in fear rather than hope, and it pushes people apart in their day-to-day lives. Fewer than 4% of marriages in America are estimated to be between registered Democrats and Republicans. That is some scary shit. But it means to me that if this miraculous thing had not happened, calling the election now, we would be having these two disordering, volatile, partisan-creating, hateful-creating events going on in the Anglosphere where people can read each other's media. And although it's true that many Americans don't listen to the BBC, a lot of Brits do read the New York Times, and they are affected by Fox News, and GB News picks up Fox News, and just you would be unleashing these disordering, mutually contagious things that would be causing hate and disorder and partisanship in our societies, and having them segregated out, having this more ordering event now, where then with the either likely Starmer victory or assured Starmer victory, creating some sense of stability and centrism and unity in the global community, I feel, my dear orderers, that mystical pull factors will be unleashed. And with the mystical pull factors, there will be a 1% swing in Michigan and Minnesota. Oh my God, that's all I can hope for. 1% mystical swing in Michigan and Minnesota. You heard it here first. So, if you enjoy mystical pull factors, what should the listeners do, Jane?
They should feel mystically pulled to clicking the follow button and also go to Jason's Substack. The link is in the show notes. And Jason, I hope you're planning a double party on July the 4th for your Independence Day barbecue and your all-night election watch party. Book the 5th off work, plan to sleep all day, have a great time.
You know, what's funny is that I have a meeting at the House of Lords on July 5th, so I'm going to be very hungover, but I hope you'll be here at the very important party that we're going to throw up here in Hampstead. It's going to be Britain's true independence from Neopopulists Day party. As always, our one, our only producer is George McDonough. The executive producer is Neil Fern. I hope you have an orderly week governed by mystical pull factors pulling you towards greater order.